The story of the two disciples travelling on the Emmaus Road is an iconic post-resurrection story. They set out on the Sunday evening for their 3-hour journey to Emmaus. Sunday because they weren't allowed to travel on a Saturday because it was a Sabbath and also the Passover. Travelling was banned. And evening because it was cooler and there was less chance of being spotted by the authorities in the encroaching dark. But they didn't know Jesus had risen. So why leave and why Emmaus? Well, the town of Emmaus had a reputation as being a hideout for freedom fighters and rebels. And they were fugitives, part of Jesus' band of renegades. Of course, all the disciples were scared, hiding away behind locked doors. But these two decided to make a break for it. Emmaus was probably the safest place for them, and maybe there was even a safe house there. There they could stay under the radar for a while. Whenever we leave behind bad or even appalling news, we talk about it as we travel. How did it happen? Why? I mean, who could have thought? And the disciples did too, because they had staked so much on Jesus' messianic movement, on the hope that he would lift the yoke of oppression from Israel. And these two literally argued the toss as they travelled out from Jerusalem in the gathering gloom. The Greek says that they threw their words between each other. It could have been this, it could have been that, it could have been the other. Maybe they were looking who to blame. Maybe they were considering who to betray to the authorities, to save their own necks, as it were. Maybe they were attempting to concoct their cover story. As they walked, it was almost as if the risen Lord had stalked these two for some time. And then he joined them, but they didn't know it was him. And they talked about all that happened, and he came alongside saying, "What things?" Well, they turned to him, or even turned on him. "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know?" There being a hint of accusation, even hostility. As listening is at the heart of loving, so Jesus paid attention to their loss and bewilderment. As wistfully they had hoped. They had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Well, I think there's a lot about us today and where the church is today, where we had hoped. How is it that on the whole we are reduced to a dwindling and ageing church? How is it after all of our true faithfulness we've seen so little fruit? I mean, what do we have to do? If you can think back far enough, we've had the Billy Graham campaigns of the 1950s and 1960s. Numerous local churches and missions were held with students from the colleges, training ministers coming into those churches to run the missions. And then in the 1980s we had Billy Graham again with Mission England, and we took coaches most nights from Leeds down to Sheffield. After Billy Graham there was Louis Palau and many other evangelists who came to preach. And then in the 1990s, the church has decided to have a decade of evangelism. This was then followed by the enthusiastic church planting movement, and then John Wimber's power evangelism blew through the church, followed by the Kansas City Prophets, the Toronto Blessings, and many others beside. And we may want to ask, what do we have to do? And often we were given the impression we just need one more push. I think we too are lost and bewildered, for we too had hoped. And often we look for someone to blame. Often it seems to be the believers for not believing. But sometimes too liberals or Catholics, the television, Stephen Dawkins, Sunday trading or Sunday sports. Maybe we're trying to concoct our cover story to save our reputations. But back on the Emmaus Road, Jesus came to embrace them in their trauma and then ignite their hope, as their bitter disappointment leached from their souls. How did he do this? He did it by reframing their story of faith, by reinterpreting the texts of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that they had lived with for so long. He started with Moses and all the prophets and interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. We are on our road, our Emmaus Road, and Jesus is listening to us as we argue the toss, which we do so regularly and often quite effectively. He is here to embrace us in our trauma and offer us new hope. How? By reframing our story of faith, by reinterpreting the biblical text we have lived with for so long, which we thought we knew and understood and even had control over. It is not easy to say this, but I think we have become stuck in an interpretation of our texts and our history that is not appropriate for today. Maybe has never been appropriate. We've certainly become wedded to it. I don't mind if you're part of the evangelical tradition, Pentecostal, High Church movement, House Church movement, Anglo-Catholic, Roman Catholic, Charismatic, Anglican or Methodist. We have got stuck in a story which often boils down to growing the church, church survival, spreading the jam of our ministers and our money thinner across more congregations, keeping the show on the road, or trying to have snazzy worship to attract Christians from other churches, for that is how most big churches become big. We have made it to be all about the church, and is making many ill and maybe killing some too. I've often said I'm not optimistic about the church. I think there is more lost still to come. But I am hopeful that God will do something, although it probably will not be what I want or what most of us want. Jesus ended his reinterpretation of the story with these two by saying, "Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer all these things?" I've often heard over the years people say, wouldn't it be wonderful to hear that Bible study of Jesus's as they walked along that road? But what's shocking is there is no evidence that Bible study changed anything or convinced these two at all. By itself, often, words don't change things. But they were polite and well-behaved Jews, and they offered Jesus their hospitality when they arrived at Emmaus. And you may know the story well. At the meal, in the simple act of breaking bread, the guest becomes the host, as at the Last Supper. With the bread, Jesus took it, blessed it, broke it and gave it. And suddenly they knew, they saw it was the risen Lord. I think it's fascinating that it wasn't the words spoken on the road that changed things or did the trick, as it were. It was the encounter with the risen Lord. It was them recognising, seeing with different eyes. We too need a fresh encounter to convince us that our old story has run out of road. And then with the disciples, Jesus vanishes from them as soon as they see him. No chance here to cling on to a Jesus of their past. So where do we go from here? Let me just suggest three things. We need to admit our deep disappointment and loss, trauma for some. While some preachers and leaders still give the impression that one last effort is all that is needed, I think we have spent our lives, many of us, giving that one last push, and we are tired out. Many have been so wounded and hurt that they walked away, maybe to blame. Maybe many of us have been wounded and hurt, and we don't know how much longer we can go on. Well, lament is the expression of sadness, pain and loss. It's not a sin, it's honesty. And 1/3 of the Psalms are about lament, about admitting to grief, loss, threat, pain, danger, defeat. And we even have one book of the Bible which is called the Book of Lamentations. If we cannot be honest with ourselves about our "we had hoped," how can we hope to be honest with those we seek to reach? In our wistfulness, we too need to admit we had hoped for so much more. Secondly, we need to ask if Jesus is inviting us to reinterpret our biblical story afresh. As I've said, any new understanding or interpretation of the biblical story will not emerge because we sit down and have a Bible study once again. Not even if we have a prayer meeting at the same time. Not even if Jesus comes and explains it to us. Something has to happen to disrupt us at a deeper level, to disorientate us. We have to encounter Jesus afresh, and we don't like this, first through struggle, suffering, or even trauma. Many of our biblical heroes knew that journey. Elijah, King David, Peter, Paul, many others. And this is what I